The Doorstep Mixtape on Redshift Radio with Tim Lee.
It's time for your weekly dose of delectably eclectic music on the Doorstep Mixtape with your host, me, Tim Lee. This week, if you could guess from the tune there, I'm going off my usual format to celebrate this month's 60th anniversary, believe it or not, since the very first video game. All week, I've been asking listeners to choose their all-time favourite video game soundtracks, and as usual, you guys did not disappoint with some great tunes coming up in this next 2 hours. So I hope you can join me as we take a nostalgic look back over the very best video games of the last 60 years. Welcome to the show, a very special show, all about 6 decades of video games. Can you believe it's been 60 years since the very first video game? Well, let me tell you a little bit about it. Well, when you think of the birth of computer games, we usually think of the big arcade boom of the 1970s and games like Space Invaders or Pac-Man. Well, I certainly do anyway. But we start our journey a lot further back than that, 60 years into the past, this month in 1958. In 1958, physicist William, let's see if I can get this right, Higginbotham, invented what is thought to be the first video game, a basic tennis game, much like the classic 1970s video game Pong, for the Brookhaven National Laboratory where he worked. In trying to imagine this kind of era that this was coming out in, I went online to research what was number one in the charts at the time that William Higginbotham came up with this. And here it is. Try, if you will, to imagine that the start of an industry that would eventually bring us the Xbox One, the PlayStation 4, or the Nintendo Switch being soundtracked by this wonderful slice of 1950s pop. It's Connie Francis and Stupid Cupid. And Higginbotham's creation remains the novelty of a few bored scientists, believe it or not, until nearly 10 years later, in 1967, when Ralph Baer and his colleagues at Sanders Associates Incorporated developed a prototype for what would be considered the very first video games console, simply called the Brown Box. Though only a prototype, and only 7 of them ever being made, the Brown Box had many of the features that we'd expect from a video games console today. 2 controls and a range of different games. The Brown Box could be programmed to play different games by turning switches on the front. It featured games like ping pong, checkers, different sports games, target shooting with the first ever light gun back in the 60s, and a golf game which required a special attachment. Sanders licensed the Brown Box to Magnavox, which you might have heard of, which changed the name and released it as the more recognisable Magnavox Odyssey in 1972. This was the first console aimed at playing games in the home. Here is Kraftwerk next with their love letter to the computer, Computer Love, and see if you can work out why this melody sounds so familiar. Answers after this. Yes, welcome back, and we're celebrating 6 decades since the very first video game came out, or at least was invented in 1958. And you've just heard a bit of Computer Love by Kraftwerk, and I asked you just before that, could you work out why the melody was so familiar? Well, did you? Did you work it out? Well, the reason being is that the melody and chords of this song were also used by Coldplay in their 2005 hit Talk on the album X and Y. Anyway, believe it or not, the first home console had trouble taking off, and it wasn't until 1977, so nearly 20 years afterwards, and the arrival of the iconic wood-veneered Atari 2600 that video games truly went stratospheric. Video games became a $2 billion industry in the US alone, and a second generation of consoles like the Intellivision, the ColecoVision, and the much underrated all-in-one system, the Vectrex, were born. Though there was only one clear winner in this first race, and it was the Atari 2600, or Woody to its friends, with amazing games like Pitfall, Pac-Man, Pong, and Missile Command. And celebrating those first dreams of electric games, here is Phil Oakley and Giorgio Moroder with Together in Electric Dreams. Yes, I did. But as the old saying goes, what goes up must come down, and in the early 80s, the first craze for video games came to an end with an almighty crash in 1983. Sales went from 2 billion to just 100 million very quickly, and it looked like video games were destined to be resigned to a history as another fad. That was until they were salvaged by... Turn the page. Nintendo. Did I give that enough of a dramatic pause? And a certain rotund little plumber that stepped in. I love Super Mario Brothers. Got real memories of my brother in particular playing on his Nintendo Entertainment System. Big beige brick that it was, very 80s in style, like something off the Next Generation of Star Trek. Anyway, what am I on about? This is a Super Mario Brothers theme, which is instantly recognisable, but done in a slightly different way. A gypsy jazz version on guitar by Adrian Holovati, and I absolutely love this version. This is celebrating Nintendo that it swooped in, saved the video game industry with this cracker and lots more like it. The Nintendo Entertainment System totally revitalized the video game craze and helped kick off what we call the third generation of consoles and the 8-bit revolution. Into the ring came contenders like the Sega Master System, the Atari 7800 and the Commodore 64. Gaming really took off then in the late 80s and early 90s, with the two powerhouses of Sega and Nintendo battling it out to be the console king, with the equally awesome Mega Drive and Super Nintendo, and the home computer market being dominated by rivals the Atari ST and the Amiga 500, who both brought a new sophistication and imagination to gaming. Celebrating the 16-bit rival of the Mega Drive, the Super Nintendo, was Street Fighter II's Dal Sims theme, and that was from the insanely popular Street Fighter 2. So popular, in fact, I've never known a sequel to a game get so many different versions by itself. So you started off with Street Fighter, of course, which nobody remembers. Then there's Street Fighter 2, then there's Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and so it goes on for about 10 games. I lost track about that point, but yeah, it was a seriously good fighting game, that one. And so that was the 16-bit revolution, and just to finish off my celebration of the 16-bit revolution of the late 80s with the Mega Drive again, we have one of my favourites, the Street of Rage. The Street of Rage there by Yuzo Kazuro from possibly my favourite video game console, if I had to just pick one, the Sega Mega Drive.
The Doorstep Mixtape on Redshift Radio with Tim Lee.
Well, as I alluded to before, as well as video games consoles, in the late 80s, home computers got in on the act, and we had another bitter rivalry between the Atari ST and the Amiga 500. But let me tell you a little bit about my own personal memories of gaming, which kind of started around that sort of time, the late 80s, early 90s. So this is the time when I really found my own connection with gaming. Up until then, I used to love messing about on the BBC Basic at school, remember them? And watching my brother play Mario and Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles on the NES. But the Atari ST was the first system that was mine, that I had to myself, and I absolutely loved it. The games were so imaginative and felt very grown up to this 9-year-old at the time. The lines were drawn and playground gangs were formed of Sega or Nintendo fans, Atari or Amiga nuts. So I'm going to choose a couple of tunes now from my memories of the Atari ST. They did come out on the Amiga as well, as many Atari games did. There was a lot of cross-pollinization, although Amiga fans would and Atari fans would never admit it. But some great games on both systems. And I'm going to go for one called Mega Blast by Bomb the Bass. And this was actually what made me want to do this show in the first place. Very talented and a music fan in my Facebook friends called Cindy Smith. She put this next tune, Mega Blast by Bomb the Bass, onto her timeline, and it straight away took me back to one of my favourite games on the Atari ST, Xenon 2, which is like a sort of space shoot 'em up. Fantastic game, so much edge to it at the time. And she didn't actually know that it was from that game. It was a single in its own right, but I very much knew it from the game, and it made me think, do you know what? I wonder when the anniversary of video games is, because I'd love to do a retrospective gaming show. And I looked online and found out that it was October. Like, at the time this was September, so I was like, oh my goodness, I definitely have to do it now. Anyway, Mega Blast by Bomb the Bass. And then following that is the joint favourite of myself and Anthony Michael, who is a long-time listener, often listens into the show, and always has lots of nice things to say. And he says that Shadow of the Beast 2... Put your teeth in. Shadow of the Beast 2 is one of the best soundtracks and best games he's played, and I have to agree with you, Anthony. It's just absolutely beautiful. And I think one of the most atmospheric, beautiful sounding soundtracks. I could listen to the soundtrack to Shadow of the Beast without even playing the game. That's how atmospheric and beautiful it was. Really took me into a different world. And if you're a sort of 90s or 80s kid and you played on those sort of games like that one, and there was another one called Another World as well. Do you remember that one? Both very, very immersive and at the time quite open world, as they would now say, sort of games. Really imaginative. Anyway, let's get the tunes on. This is Mega Blast by Bomb the Bass from Xenon 2, and then Shadow of the Beast 2 soundtrack for me. Dedicated to me, and also dedicated to Anthony. So I hope you enjoy these two Atari ST and Amiga classics. We've been going from the very first computer game in 1958, October 1958, 60 years ago in fact, all the way up to the early 90s with the Sega Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo holding the crown for consoles, but also the Atari ST and the Amiga 500 stepping in for the home computer market, and so many great games, so many great memories. But if you were born slightly later than me, if you're not as much of an old fart as me, your computer memories may start a little bit later, and I'm going to be going a little bit later in the next hour, so all the way up to the present day in fact, and I've got so many great tunes to play for you still, so I hope you can stick around and listen to the second hour after this little short break. And computer games are about to get very, very interesting, and indeed they're about to grow up, some might say. They're going from the cartridge to the CD, and there's a new boy or a new console on the block that's just around the corner. So I'll tell you about that in the second half. But I'm going to finish off this first half with Lana Del Rey and her song, which is very apt, Video Games. Join me in a moment.